Welcome to Northern Illinois, where 2 weeks ago it was like negative 20 and 8 inches of snow, and last week was like 50 degrees and muddy, and now we're back to 20 degrees and snow out again. But what are we doing? Where are we at? What's going on? Well, we are in Richard's Grain Shack. Yeah, that's what we'll call it. We'll go with the Richard's Grain Shack. So we talked about a little bit back in the fall when we were combining about getting our grain down to the right moisture content or whatever moisture content it is when we were combining it. But now we're trying to store this grain. We're trying to keep it for a long period of time. So we have to get our grain down even farther in our moisture content. So that brings up the question, do farmers cook their grain? Like, is that something they do? Do farmers sit there with an oven and they turn it up to 400 degrees and they put a timer for 15 minutes and then they walk away and they come back and they pull their corn out like I do with the pizza? No, not quite. A little more scaled up. But what we're doing here is we're talking about grain drying. And what does it take to dry grain? Well, essentially, in a short, condensed version, is we have to force hot air past all the kernels of corn. And by forcing the hot air through all these kernels of corn, our goal is to pull out the moisture that's inside those kernels to get it down to our desired grain storage moisture content. So we're going to talk about corn. That's mainly what we grow up here in Northern Illinois. And that content of moisture, we're looking at 14 to 15% is kind of where the magical area where we want to be at. If it's too much wetter than that, then what can happen is it's ripe for mold to start growing. It's wet inside my grain bins and it's dark, so molds can start growing in there, funguses, bacteria, and it will start to rot and deteriorate and spoil my grain. And what can even start to happen is you can get what they call hot spots inside of your grain bins. And essentially, your grain starts getting hot and it has the ability to even get hot enough to catch on fire, which is, I've never seen it happen, but I've heard of it happening before. But on the flip side of that is, I don't want it to be too much drier than that either, because if it's too much drier, now I'm putting in more time, money, fuel to get that grain dried down, and you know what? I'm not going to get paid more for my grain being drier or being too dry. So it's a balancing act, and that 14, 15% is kind of that right on spot where you want to be, because your grain's not gonna spoil and go bad on you inside your grain bin. You're still gonna be able to move it through your augers and get it out into your trucks, and you're not wasting more money by drying it down more than you need to. So I guess one way you can think about it, if that's not quite making sense for you, is let's say you're cooking a pan of brownies. And if I don't leave my pan of brownies in the cooker for long enough inside my oven, it's still going to be wet. It's still going to be kind of gooey. I'm not saying that's a bad thing when it comes to brownies, but you don't want that to be the scenario with corn. But if you leave it in too long, and what's going to happen is you can burn your brownies. It's going to become hard and crunchy, and like my brother makes his brownies. He's made them one time, and that's it. But he made them too hard. Sidetrack. So if you bring them in, if you cook it for too long, then it also can be a problem too. Your corn can burn if you leave it in too long inside our cookers. So, well, what's that bring us into? I think that's the next thing that leads us into is, how do we cook our grain? What's it look like? What are our options for cooking grain, drying grain? As you can probably guess, we don't have a oven sitting out here that we're putting in a pan of corn every 15 minutes and cooking it. So what does grain drying look like? Let's take a look at it, and we'll show you a little bit of how our grain system works. It's a little bit difficult because there is snow on the ground right now, but it is what it is. You get out here at the white snow, in the sun, it is very bright. So, I can't even look at the camera. Let's put the hand from the sun. Goodness gracious. 4 options that are available to farmers that I can think of in order to dry their grain down. Option 1 is they just send it right off to the elevator and let the elevator do the drying for them. Don't handle it all. Let someone else deal with the hassle of drying their grain. The second option that comes to me is, you know what? You just leave it out in your field. Is that over time, eventually the sun's heat units from the sun, obviously no heat units today, it's cold, the heat from the sun and the wind will dry down that grain a little bit more in the field. It won't quite dry it down nearly as fast, but it will take out some more moisture, and some farmers will do that. They'll just leave their crop sit out in their field until it is, dry enough for them to go out there and harvest it. They can put it right into their grain bins. But a problem with that is that windstorms can come up, snow can come up, and it can either bury your crop, blow your crop over. But you don't have to worry about drying your grain down. So those are two options. I think there's two more options that come to mind, and we'll head over to the grain system and talk about that, hopefully where it's not nearly as bright. Okay, so now we're at option 3 that farmers have for drying grain, and as you can tell, it's probably really echoey. We'll look up. What are we in? We're inside of a grain bin, which is pretty much just a giant pop can, but we're going to store grain inside something like this. And farmers can dry grain by just putting it inside the bin, but not just by simply putting it inside the bin. They have to force, like I said before, hot air through their grain bin. And so I'll show you here on the floor of these grain bins, there's a ton of little slits in here, all in these little grooves. So what will happen is on the outside, I will show you on the outside of the grain bin here, is that the farmer can have a big fan on the outside of their grain bin. And then they can, inside that fan, they can have a series of burners that's going to burn off gas, like natural gas, propane, and that hot air is then going to get forced underneath the grain bin, and then through those little slits in the floor, the hot air is going to rise up through the grain and out the top, and it's going to take out that extra moisture that we don't want. Somebody wrote my name in the dust of the grain bin. Some other inappropriate things behind it. I won't show that. So the hot air is going to get forced up through the grain, the kernels of grain, and as it goes by all the kernels of grain inside of here, it will take out the moisture, and it'll take it up and throughout the top of the grain bin, and usually it'll condensate up on the roof up here, and then it will drip down the sides and drip right out of the grain bin. And that's an effective way of drying grain. It's a little more tricky way of drying grain. Okay, so here's an idea of a big squirrel cage fan. As you can see, it's a pretty large thing. I mean, it's not quite sitting on the ground, but it's about a 5-foot tall fan. So what they can have in here, this is going to suck air in from the outside. And there's going to be a series of burners inside of there. And it's going to force that air underneath the grain bin. There's a cavity underneath that floor with the slits I was just talking about. And that air is going to get forced up underneath the grain bin that's behind me. And it will go through the slits, through all the air spaces between the kernels of corn. There's snow falling off the roofs of other grain bins. It's forced up and through the grain, and the hot air will exit the top with the moisture inside of it, and then hopefully leave and not come back in the grain bins. That's option number 4. We're going to send it through something like this. Gosh, that sun's still really bright. This is our grain dryer or grain oven. And I think it's important to know, how does the grain oven dryer work? So what's going to happen first is right here, you can't tell right now. I know I had a video of this in the fall, but these are my grain pits. So there's big holes in the ground right here. I'm going to dump it from my semi-truck, my wagons, whatever it is, and it's going to go through these augers coming up out of the ground. Then it's going to go through another set of augers, travel up, and get dumped into this bin right here. Now this bin right here for us is just a wet bin. So that means it's just going to be wet corn that comes right out of the field. So if it's 20% corn, 25% corn, whatever it is, that is where our wet corn gets stored. But only for a short period of time, because what's going to happen from there, it's going to drop down through there, go right back up that leg again, and drop down to the top of our grain dryer. Is it about right now where I'm wishing I'd listened to my mother and brought gloves, but we're going to act like it's fine and okay. Now, this is more commonly what you'll see today on most farms, and instead of trying to dry inside of a grain bin, or letting it dry out in the field, we'll have a standalone unit like this, and it's going to batch dry grain and does it a lot more efficiently. Now, how does it do that? Let's hop inside of it, and we'll get an idea for it. Milliford, do you realize how cold it is? Gosh, what are you doing out here? Goodness gracious. Well, we've made it into the belly of the grain cooker, the grain oven. The things I do for you guys. Good. Okay, so we've made it into the belly, the inside of our grain oven, our grain dryer. We are in the lower half of this grain dryer. There's two halves. And the first thing that you might have noticed is that if you're in the middle of it, how come I can see right through it? And, well, that's because we need the air to get through here, right? So let's explain how this thing works. So the grain comes at the top. Like we said, the grain's going to come in there from the field, and it's going to be wet. And the goal of my grain dryer is by the time that grain goes down to the bottom, I want it to be dry. I want it to be able to go right into my grain bin. And for this purpose, I want it to be 14, 15%, somewhere around in there, so I know that's not going to mold, and I'm not spending more time drying it than I have to. And so I have to get this grain dried down. And the grain is going to fill this cavity. There's a screen here on the inside, and there's another screen on the outside, and there's, I don't know, about a foot in between them. And so the grain is going to fill up the outside shell of this grain dryer, and it's going to make a shell around the area I'm in right now. So the area I'm in right here right now won't ever get grain in it. But what it is going to get in it, it's going to get forced air. So let me introduce to you one of my two biggest fans. What can I say? He really can blow me off my feet sometimes. And, you know, sometimes I get caught up in a whirlwind when I'm around him. I'll stop there. I'm sorry. So that fan behind me right there is spinning. It's going to force air into this cavity that I'm sitting in right now. And which then is going to build up pressure inside of here, and it's going to blow that air through this first screen, through the corn that's right there, and out the outer screen. And now, like on the grain bin, there's a burner ring in there. Kind of right there in the middle. I don't know, move my finger in a random circle. In the middle of it, there's also another burner ring. So I can heat up this air. And I heat up that air, I can dry down my grain a lot faster. And in this particular dryer, there's a fan above me, and there's a fan in this lower cavity that I'm in right now. And so I can send forced hot air through here, through a smaller section of grain, and right out the outside, get that extra moisture that I don't want inside of my kernels of grain, and send it right out through the outside. You know, if I got grain that's wetter or grain that's drier, I need to be able to adjust how fast that grain can fall through here. So I've got underneath my feet, I got a series of augers and a metering roll that's going to meter how fast the corn falls through. So if I've got 25 or 30% corn, I need that corn to spend more time in the dryer. I need it to go down slower and spend more time with the hot air going past it to draw out more of the moisture. So I can slow down my metering rolls, and the grain can go through a little slower, and it'll dry it out until it gets to that 14, 15%. But let's say it's 20%, then I can speed up my rolls. I can make it go through a little bit faster because, you know what, I don't need to dry it down as much. I don't have to spend as much time and energy drying that down. And it really is a balancing act. It's a trick. And it takes a lot of experience. I'm not any good at it. I've never even done it myself. It's always been Richard's baby to dry down grain, but he'll tell me every time I get out of the semi or tractor, I bring grain in here, how to run it. So all my knowledge from this comes from Richard, not really from any much firsthand experience. But the goal of this grain dryer is take the wet grain from the top, and by the time it gets down the bottom, I need it to be at my 14, 15%, somewhere around in there. It's a little more complicated. There's a couple more steps to that, but I need it to be dry so it goes into my big bin, my dry bin. So how do we do it? We do it with forced air. Forced hot air, same thing with the grain bin, and that is the key to drying down grain, but there's still more steps to get into the grain bin, and Now I have to figure out how to work my way back out of here. Give me a second. All right, I wasn't planning on talking about this, but I think it's kind of cool, so I think we will. So we've got our grain, our wet grain came in at the top of our grain dryer. It's worked its way down at the bottom, and now it's dry grain. And now I need to get it moved from here, taken away, and sent up into my grain bin, my dry grain bin. Now you can use augers, you can use conveyor belts, but we kind of got a unique system. It's not uncommon to see this in the grain moving, the farm world, but it's kind of cool. And I got a little unique way to show how it works, I think. So we use air. So you can see here we got running on the ground. We've got some metal tubes that kind of go in all sorts of different directions. So what's going to happen is we got our dry grain coming out of our grain dryer here, and it's going to fall down into this contraption here that's called an airlock. And so I've got big blower fans over here in the shed, and it's going to send pressurized air through these metal tubes, and grain's going to fall down into this little airlock, and then it's going to send it through in what we call plugs of grain. It's going to plug the system, and the air pressure is going to push it through my metal tubes, and it's going to take it all the way up and into the top of my grain bins, and then let it fall down into the grain bin. And that might be a little bit difficult, a little hard to understand. So I think I got a good way to show how it might work. So hold on. Okay, so we've all been here before. We've all done this sort of thing before, where you're at a restaurant, you're waiting for your food to come, and you know what? You're getting a little bit bored. And you get tempted because, let's say, your sibling's being a little bit annoying, and you want to be annoying back to them. So you take the straw out of your water cup, and you tear off the corner of your napkin, and you take a little piece of paper, put it in your mouth, you wet it up a little bit, and you wait for that perfect opportunity. The opportunity when your siblings aren't looking, your parents aren't looking, and you're hoping that your sibling opens up their mouth and you can shoot a spit wad right into their mouth. Man, let's try this way. That did not go as planned. It might have frozen there because it's so cold. Hold on. No. We've all been there before. Maybe my spit wad's a little too big. Let's try this again. See if you can get them. Oh, I'm sorry. That was a bullseye. But what you do is you put your spit wad inside your straw and you shot it out. And hopefully you hit your target and you didn't hit the guy sitting behind him. We've all done it before. So that's exactly what's happening here in the grain system. Okay, not exactly. But we're making our own grain spit wad. We essentially got a grain spit wad cannon. That could be another good video. Light bulb. So we're blowing the grain from here all the way up into our grain bin with like a wad of grain that goes through our tube. And it's going to go from here up to the top of that grain bin in a matter of a second or two. So let's follow the grain now to the grain bin and see what it looks like inside of there. It's a long way to the top. That's going to start a grain avalanche. I love that sound. Hear that? Probably can see it. The sound of grain falling. It makes like little rivers, like an avalanche. So we are in the dry soda pop can, the big grain bin, the big metal tube. And our grain is flowing. It's at 14.5%. That's exactly where we want it to be. We've been hauling it out. We're cleaning out the grain bin here now. There's not much left in here anymore. And 14.5%, worked out well. There was no mold in our grain. It never got hot. There was no hot spots anywhere. The grain quality stayed very well. Nothing spoiled on us. And that's exactly what you want to have happen. Everything flows. Everything works well. And this is kind of the last spot for it. Before it leaves here, when it leaves here, it's going to get loaded up on a truck. We're cleaning it up out of the grain bin. It's going to go through some more augers, up in the semi-truck, and off to the elevator to get turned into livestock feed. Maybe it goes to the ethanol plant, gets turned into fuel. There's a ton of different uses for it. But if we can't store it, then you're not going to have any grain to be able to sell later. So 14, 15% is where we're at. And how did we get here? How did we get to this point right here? Well, if you remember, back in October, we were combining this corn. And I was on top of the grain bin saying, this is some wet corn, 25, almost 30% corn, a lot of moisture in it. And it went from that combine into the semi dropped it into the pits, went up into our wet bin put it in our grain dryer dried it down, then it shot through our air cannon, our grain spit wad cannon, up in the top of this grain bin. And then it fell down into here and sat. We cooled it down. It sat here for 4 or 5 months, however long it's been. And now it's ready to go on to the next phase, next area. And that about sums up all the small little steps that happens to get our grain dried. Grain ovens. I guess that means maybe farmers should be considered master chefs or professional cookers. I don't know. Someone can come up with a word for it, not me. Well, there you have it. That's how we're drying grain. This is how farmers cook their grain. Guess you know what this means. I need you to like and subscribe, follow for the next video. Get any ideas, let me know. Send them my way. Until then, see you next time. Oh, my hands are so cold. Climbing up that ladder, metal ladder. Climbing up that ladder, my hands are freezing. Oh. My mother was right, I should have worn gloves.